Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program, Fraud and Tragedy in the Quest to Cure Alzheimer's with Charles Piller. Tonight we dig deep into a world of fraud, corruption, and greed, a world that Charles will argue has set back our understanding of Alzheimer's for an untold number of years, while more than 30 million people worldwide suffer with the disease, and countless more suffer as concerned loved ones and caregivers. My name is Rachel Myrow, and I'm a senior editor of KQED's Silicon Valley News Desk, and I promise I'll be able to read my questions better than I can say my own name and title. And now, on to the show. Joining me tonight is Charles Piller, an investigative journalist for Science Magazine. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Sacramento Bee, and many other publications. He's reported on public health, biological warfare, infectious disease outbreaks, and other topics from the United States, Africa, Asia, Europe, and Central America. He's the author of Gene Wars, The Fail-Safe Society, and now Doctored, Fraud, Arrogance, and Tragedy in the Quest to Cure Alzheimer's. So I thought, Charles, that we might start by explaining how Alzheimer's is a dramatic downside to the otherwise positive fact that so many of us are living longer.
Sure, yeah. So let me just take us back briefly to the genesis of how this disease was named. So back in 1906, a German scientist by the name of Alois Alzheimer, he was both a clinician treating patients and also a pathologist. So pathologist, someone who does autopsies and tries to understand the biology behind certain diseases. And Alzheimer had a patient who had really terrible dementia, and after she died, he examined her brain and found these two kinds of protein deposits. One is called amyloid proteins, and these are the characteristic so-called sticky plaques that people talk about with Alzheimer's disease. And the other is something called tangles, another kind of way of describing a very tangled-shaped protein that's now called tau protein. And he defined the disease as the combination of plaques, tangles, and dementia. So the neuroscientists of the age were very interested, of course, and there was some discussion about it, but not really very much intensity of research for a very long time. And the reason is simple demographics, as you've implied. Back in the early 1900s, really through the middle of the century and into the maybe even into the 60s, not that many people were growing to the very old age that is characteristic of the time where people would get Alzheimer's disease. But as lifespans increased because of all the amazing medical developments, the breakthroughs in heart disease and cancer and stroke and other killers, a lot more people were growing old, which is wonderful, but also it meant that a lot more people were getting Alzheimer's disease.
First, memory loss, then increasing difficulty with the basic tasks of life, and then ultimately you lose your sense of yourself, of who you are. Does that describe Alzheimer's in a nutshell?
I think so. It's one of the most terrifying ailments because unlike other dreaded diseases, first of all, people kind of lose their personality. I guess some people would argue that you don't completely lose your personality necessarily, but you lose your ability to navigate the world and to remember loved ones, and it's an incredibly tragic kind of experience in that way.
So you've mentioned amyloids. For the benefit of everyone here tonight, tell us what the amyloid hypothesis is and when it came to prominence.
So the amyloid hypothesis is the most dominant way of thinking about what causes Alzheimer's disease. And it's a very logical and thoughtful way of looking at the disease, which is why it became so dominant and so prevalent in scientific thinking and in medical thinking. And so it basically runs like this. As Alzheimer himself saw, there were the presence of these amyloid proteins in the brain. And we know now that they take the form of both these sticky plaques and also these soluble forms that kind of float around in the fluid that bathes the brain. And these two forms of amyloid basically were postulated in the early 1990s to cause a cascade of biomedical, biochemical effects in the brain that lead to both cell death and dementia. And because we know that people who have dementia, often when they die and maybe there's an autopsy of their brain, you see copious deposits of amyloid proteins. It had a certain logic and it had a certain sense of ground truth, you might say. And as a result, it became a very widely accepted idea. And what it led to was years and years of efforts to create a way of removing these amyloid plaques and these other forms of amyloid from the brain, with the assumption that if you can do that, you can improve people's cognitive experience.
And yet the drugs that have been developed in this line of research have not worked.
No, it's been a very difficult and troubling period of many years where there was the development of these drugs, and usually the drugs that have been developed in this regard are called antibody drugs. The human body creates antibodies to fight off diseases, viruses, bacteria, and this is a way that naturally we're able to live as long as we do because we have that natural ability. The drugs that have been created for Alzheimer's to remove these amyloids from your brain, these are, in a sense, artificial antibodies. They're created in a lab, and then they are infused into people through their vein. And what they found is that they're very successful at removing amyloid proteins from the brain, but they're very unsuccessful in the goal of either arresting or reversing the cognitive symptoms of Alzheimer's disease.
I don't think I'm ever going to be able to forget some of the ghastly fatalities and brain injuries among the drug trial volunteers that you describe in this book. It's truly horrific, and for little to no benefit. And so it makes me wonder what accounts for the stickiness of this idea, this theory, this umbrella theory among scientists.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I've had to ponder over and over again because there's a little bit of mystery to it. But when a scientific idea gets to be so dominant that it crowds out others thinking in the field, there end up being a lot of sunk costs. So that means that billions of dollars of investment in research associated with this by the federal government, billions of dollars of investment by pharmaceutical companies to do drug development associated with it, and also the sunk costs of whole careers of eminent scientists that were based on the belief in this idea and the belief in the singularity of it. And what I mean is that not just that amyloids had something to do with Alzheimer's, but that amyloids had everything to do with it. And when you have this confluence of factors, the career aspirations of important people, the enormous spending and enormous investment, and then the very, very minimal beneficial results associated with the latest drugs that have been developed, you have what often seems like a kind of overwhelming dominance of scientific thinking and medical thinking. That's changing a bit now, but it's been the prevalent way of looking at the disease for decades.
Well, yeah, I guess we could call it confirmation bias if it weren't for what you found, what other volunteer fact checkers, if you will, have found, which is copious evidence of doctored images and dubious papers that should have been pulled from publication.
Sure, it's been a big problem. I think maybe a good way to understand it is to go back to 2006. So what was happening then was that there had been some of these anti-amyloid antibody drugs and even a vaccine that scientists developed, drug companies had been testing, and the results were very, very disappointing. And so not only were these drugs, did they have hazards, which I can go into in a bit, but they also were very unsuccessful in trying to either reduce the rate of cognitive decline in patients or have any real benefit for arresting or reversing Alzheimer's symptoms. But then, so of course, naturally, people became somewhat discouraged at this point. There was skepticism was growing about the amyloid hypothesis because of the lack of success of drug development. And what happened was, in 2006, a very clever experiment was done in a lab at the University of Minnesota. And what they did is that they had mice that were genetically engineered to produce copious volumes of amyloids in mice brains. And they extracted these proteins from the mice brains and purified one specific type of amyloid protein. They called it amyloid beta star 56, their star protein, kind of a, in the scientific world at least, a catchy name. And one that allowed them to grab a little bit of mind share in the scientific community. And what they did is they injected this very specific amyloid protein into rats. And then very quickly, the rats showed what appeared to be the kind of memory loss symptoms that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. And so what you had is, for the first time, a kind of cause and effect relationship between a specific amyloid protein and the symptoms of dementia associated with Alzheimer's, albeit in an animal experiment. But to give you a sense of where the field was at, this was gigantic news. It became one of the most cited experiments in Alzheimer's disease for the following 15 to 20 years. And what was really interesting about it is that it gave new hope to people who were becoming discouraged about the efficacy of this set of ideas related to the amyloid hypothesis. And suddenly it injected new funding and reinvigorated the scientific community to think that we're on the right track. So now I'm going to fast forward to 2022. And in 2022, I started to look at this set of problems and started to ask some questions about the range of research being done in the labs that are interested in Alzheimer's. And I got connected with a guy by the name of Matthew Schrag, who's a neuroscientist at Vanderbilt University. And he had been engaged in looking at laboratory science behind the development of a drug called Simufilm, which is an Alzheimer's drug. And it's kind of a long story, which I won't talk about right now, but we can get into if you want later. And what he found was that a lot of the images in laboratory work that led to the development of this drug and ultimately the testing in humans was based on apparently doctored images. And so it was completely unreliable in his way of thinking. So Schrag was beginning to experiment with how he could be better at detecting possibly doctored images in other Alzheimer's research, to ask a more basic question. How broadly was this a problem in the field? Was it just a very narrow problem involving a very narrow set of scientists and their work, or was it something that represented a bigger challenge and question for both scientists and clinicians? And in the process, he was kind of poking around on this website called PubPeer, which is a place where people can post ideas about possibly suspect images and ask the scientists behind those experiments to see if they had an explanation for why some images might not look quite right. And he stumbled into a series of experiments from this guy at the University of Minnesota by the name of Sylvain Lesne and his mentor, Karen Ash. and who is an illustrious scientist in this field. And in the process, he and I were just becoming acquainted, and we started to have these really long Zoom calls and phone calls to try to understand what was going on in the field in a way that would maybe be newsworthy for me as a reporter for science. And he found a study that we then were talking about in January of 2022 that was pretty much so stunning that both of us were kind of sat there in a bit of a stunned silence for a while to try to understand the implications of it. And this was the study that I was describing a few minutes ago. This was from 2006 from the lab in the University of Minnesota. It was published in the illustrious and important journal Nature, which is, when you get an article in there, you're going to have a lot of influence in the field. And what Schrag saw and what I was beginning to comprehend as a reporter is that it challenged some fundamental ideas behind the validity of the amyloid hypothesis and could have important implications for the trajectory of that and how it was treated in the scientific community.
Science is supposed to self-correct. That's the promise. Do you see Schrag's sleuthing as that self-correction in evidence, or what happened instead?
Well, so this resulted in a period of months where he did a lot of extra digging into this particular scientist, Lesnay, and his mentor, Karen Ash, to try to find out whether the range of work that they were doing on this so-called star protein, amyloid beta star 56, was also some issue of concern. And as part of my reporting process, of course, after I did my due diligence to ensure that I felt that Schrag was a credible guy, and I went through a process of also having his work checked by a number of important experts in forensic image analysis, and I'm pretty sure one of those people who is central to that process is in the audience, but I can't see you. So I'm seeing someone waving. That's Elizabeth Bick, who is really the most illustrious person in that field globally, and was incredibly generous in not just helping to examine the studies associated with this amyloid beta star 56 protein and the research that it was based on, but also she was instrumental in looking at hundreds of papers for my book. And so, Elizabeth, thank you again.
Yes, absolutely. It deserves a round of applause, this work. And I understand you have a little news to report tonight. Yeah,
well, we're jumping ahead a little bit, but on Friday of last week, Sylvain Lesnay, the scientist who was behind this notorious set of doctored images, resigned from his tenured full professorship at the University of Minnesota. And so the university took years to investigate the findings that were part of my initial work that led to this book. But it's an amazing moment because so often the people who have been involved in this kind of misconduct pretty much get off scot-free. So I'm really happy to report that that happened. I don't take any pleasure in someone's career being destroyed, but this is work that had real and incredibly serious consequences for the field. And it's important that the field, as you say, correct. It's self-correcting. In the long run, science is self-correcting. You can't cure a disease with false research. But it can often take a very long time for that self-correction to take place. And that's why it's vital for people like Elizabeth and Matthew Schrag and journalists to be able to go after these important cases of apparent misconduct and force the scientific community to act on them much more quickly than they otherwise would have. And not to press the point too hard, but this is not a victimless crime. No, not at all. I mean, I think we all have to remember that so many of us are touched by Alzheimer's disease. I myself, my mother had Alzheimer's, and most of us either know someone in our own family or a friend who has had this terrible disease and know that the human cost is astronomical, aside from the financial cost. I mean, I think it would be important to mention that an estimated $350 billion a year in the United States is spent by the families of Alzheimer's victims in providing services and caring for people with Alzheimer's. This is approximately equal to all the other spending by every other entity in caring for Alzheimer's patients, including Medicare. So it's a disease that can both cause enormous emotional harm for the families who are taking care of loved ones, but also they can become financially impoverished as a result of it. And so when I see research that has been doctored in such a way that it sets back the goal of finding effective treatments, I don't feel any pain in watching people who were involved in that have their careers come down.
I think you've gone some way towards already answering my next question, which is you can understand why a scientist, with his eye on the prize, wanting to grab the brass ring, would doctor the evidence, to meet other people's bias, the prevailing theory of the time. They wanted to see that information, but you would think that Nature, that other scientific publications, you would think that drug makers have so much on the line, their credibility in essence. Mm-hmm. It's the money they can make whether or not the drug works, eh?
Yeah. Let me respond in a way that provides just a tiny bit more context for that, which is that I believe very strongly that the vast, vast majority of Alzheimer's scientists, just like the vast majority of people in all walks of life, are honest, are trying to do their level best to, be ethical people and do their work in an ethical way. And in Alzheimer's in particular, people are incredibly eager and sometimes feel a sense of desperation to provide some solution for patients, understandably. And I think it would be a mistake to draw conclusions that because some of this research was improperly altered, some fraud exists in the field, that it generally characterizes the field. The problem is that some limited amount of strategically placed misconduct can influence thinking in a very serious way, and as a result, delay progress that we need to provide adequate treatments for the disease. And so, yes, it's a tragic, and really it's something that all of us should feel angry about, but it would be a mistake to generalize it too broadly.
Well, I wonder though, as I was reading this book, I was thinking, where were the regulators? So where were the journals, right? Where were the drug makers? Where was the accountability in the system?
Yeah, it's a really great question, in part because, look, I'm someone who has written a lot about the institutional authorities of science. And when I say that, what I mean are the journals, the funders like the National Institutes of Health, the regulators like the Food and Drug Administration, and the universities themselves. And I have found that all four of those very important entities have really fallen down on the job. They've been complacent, and they have not done an adequate job of monitoring and policing the possibility that fraud or misconduct has gone on that has had terrible effects in skewing thinking in the scientific fields and in delaying progress towards finding real remedies for Alzheimer's that are more effective. So I'm very critical of them. That said, right now we're in a pretty disturbing and I think troubling time in the history of science, which is that the current administration in Washington is doing things that seem designed to tear down these institutions. Now, so let me be clear. I am very critical of all of those institutions. I think they've, in many cases, done a terrible job in holding up the best principles of science. They have been complacent, and they have been basically enablers in certain ways of some very bad practices. That said, I think we're extremely fortunate in this country to have these extremely effective agencies in other ways. They have been funding enormous amounts of research that is very important for providing remedies and cures to diseases. They've even done a lot of funding of important work in Alzheimer's disease that I think is beneficial and I support wholeheartedly. They have provided a good and relatively safe drug supply for us as well. But so I do not subscribe at all to the idea that they need to be torn apart or torn down or having their institutional memories eradicated through firing of important employees. That said, as a journalist, I have no alternative but to expose the weaknesses and the areas where they've failed to do their job, because really it's vitally important for us to improve them and to show areas that they can be improved.
What do you say to the people of, it's really not even a Republican persuasion, it's a libertarian persuasion, who say decades of self-dealing, the revolving door between the regulatory side and drug makers and other professionals in the industry, the short selling of pharmaceutical stocks. I mean, all of this predates the latest Trump administration. Mm-hmm. What do you say to people who are like, you know what, let's clear the decks. This isn't working, this entire system.
Yeah, I say that, first of all, these are institutions that have very effective and beneficial results in many areas. So let's take the examples of heart disease and cancer, which are the two biggest killers in the United States. And one of the things that we can say clearly is that because of the research that's been funded by NIH, because of the regulatory prowess of the Food and Drug Administration, because of the brilliance of scientists at universities all over the country, we've been able to see death rates from those diseases decline because there have been a lot of effective tools that have been developed. For cancer, for example, radiation, chemotherapy, that have been beneficial in reducing death rates. Even some of these diseases, certain kinds of heart disease, there have even been cures so that people are living longer lives, and often lives that are incredibly fruitful and free of disease. So I would again caution for people who want radical solutions. If the radical solutions are tear everything down and start from scratch, I think that's foolhardy. And I think it's ignoring the great benefits of what we've accomplished in this country through these institutional authorities of science, where I think the argument makes a lot of sense and is something that we need to pay attention to, is that self-dealing and, as you say, the revolving door between government and industry and corruption in the field that has been allowed to get through the kind of complacency that takes the position that these are our colleagues, of course they aren't going to be doing anything wrong, or has taken the position that we need to stay the course with a particular way of looking at the disease, no matter what failures we see in drug development. Those are things we can and should be critical of. Those are things that can be course corrected without completely destroying the agencies and all of the beneficial work that they also do.
Have you received blowback from some people who are distressed about what's happening now in Washington, D.C., saying, now is not the time to be airing the dirty laundry, what are you doing?
I have, as a matter of fact. So let me say, first of all, that this book was written during the Biden administration. And it is coming out at a moment in our history where there is a lot of extremely dangerous, wrong-headed ideas being implemented. And, I am very critical of the ideas of RFK Jr., and I'm very critical of the idea of reducing the overhead expenses of institutions that receive grants from NIH to the level where they can't really function well. So yes, I am concerned about all those things. Now, it's interesting, just recently, a scientist who I deeply appreciate the work of and who I find to be quite courageous and who has been personally a victim of the situation where the institutional authorities of science are so committed to the amyloid hypothesis that she has found that her work has been shunted aside and she has not been able to get the money that she needs for some of her experiments. And she's had to change the way in which she does research in order to have her stuff funded because of the prejudice against people who are taking a different path in that field. And yet she wrote, she's been trolling me in social media. And I was sort of stunned by it because this is someone who I have interviewed many times and like and considered to be a person of great integrity. But I think the pressure to circle the wagons at this moment has meant that people are challenging some pretty basic concepts, including whether people should be journalists right now. And I find it to be complete misunderstanding of what journalism is about. So basically, it's our obligation as journalists to write about these agencies and to expose where the wrongdoing lies. If we didn't, we would be betraying patients. We would be betraying honest scientists. And it's our responsibility to go forward with that, even if certain people in the political world might misuse this information to criticize these agencies, might misuse it for their own political purposes. And while I lament that, I will never stop believing strongly in the importance of exposing wrongdoing for public benefit.
So if we could bring her, and for that matter, President Trump, and for that matter, Elon Musk into the room with us today, what would you suggest about how things should roll forward in the next 4 years?
Well, there are so many things that they're proposing that I agree with. That I disagree with completely. And there are a few things that they're proposing that I do agree with. One is, I think it's healthy to give an examination of these institutions and to clean up some of the self-dealing that goes on and to clean up the complacency that we see. If that requires jolting them into a better state of awareness, I think that's important. Let me give you an example of something that was shocking even to me, and believe me, I've developed kind of a bit of cynicism about some of these matters over the years. So there's a guy who was, until recently, the head of the Division of Neuroscience of the National Institutes of Health, and his name is Eliezer Maslia. And when I say until recently, it's because for the work that I did in the course of doing research for this book, I looked very deeply into his work, and with the assistance of Elizabeth and other forensic image experts, including Matt Schrag, and two others I'll name, this woman, Mu Yang, who is an expert in this at Columbia University, and Kevin Patrick, who is not a scientist, but who is just somebody who has a lot of computer skills, and he's learned how to analyze these images. And the four of them took a close look at the work of this guy, Eliezer Maslia, because he is so important in being an institutional leader, an influential scientist, and as the head of this division, the head of the center of funding for Alzheimer's research, Parkinson's research, and other neurological conditions. And what was found in their sleuthing and in my research was that for 25 years, he had been engaged in studies for which there was strong evidence that the images were doctored or reused in inappropriate ways in multiple experiments. It was pretty stunning because of his importance, his centrality to this work. And when my story about Maslia came out last fall in the pages of Science magazine. The same day it came out, the National Institutes of Health said that he was being removed from his job in this post. They, in fact, timed their announcement to coincide with the day my story appeared. And it was a pretty stunning moment because of the position that he had. But I'll tell you what was even more stunning to me, and this goes directly to your question about the efforts now to reform those agencies. When I asked the National Institutes of Health whether they had vetted him for possible image doctoring before they hired him to this illustrious and important post, their answer was not only had they not, but they didn't think that doing that would be beneficial to improving research at the National Institutes of Health. And to me, this was so clueless and so hidebound and really so tragic that they would take that position, that it made me realize that, again, as critical as I am of the Trump administration's, slash and burn approach to reform, there is a level of complacency and inaction in these agencies that needs to be addressed. It's important to address it. And if a way can somehow be found to do that without destroying the agencies in the process, of course, that would be very beneficial.
I suppose even if the federal government retreats from funding a lot of research, both intelligent research and misguided research, there will still be, at least in the case of Alzheimer's, wealthy people who are experiencing it in their family or perhaps themselves who are willing to throw money at future exploration. But what's so distressing about that is that there are so many diseases where that's not the case. It's rare, or people aren't making the connection with whatever the issue is in their own lives. Or the people who are making the connection don't have any money, so they can't change the storyline.
Yeah, and I think because Alzheimer's has become so prevalent in our society and it affects so many of us, it's really an opportunity. Unlike rarer diseases for which they're quite tragic, but there isn't a kind of a critical mass of interest as a result. With Alzheimer's, there's an enormous amount of money going into it. There's enormous interest. There's enormous public support for doing it in the best way. And I have to say that one thing that does really encourage me as I look at the landscape of work that's going on is that even though the singular way of looking at it, the amyloid hypothesis, has been so prevalent for so many years, new thinking is coming into the field and innovative thinking. And as a result, I feel like there's a lot of hope for diversifying the way in which the disease is approached in such a way that could yield unexpected benefits, unexpected remedies in years to come.
I'm noticing as the time draws near, we still have about a half an hour, but if you have questions that you would like me to put to Charles, please write it down on a card or send a message online, and I'll be able to fold those in. But I thought, we might broaden out the conversation a little bit. We are also here in the San Francisco Bay Area, home of the AI revolution, such as it is, a knife that cuts both ways when it comes to medical research. And I'd be very curious to get your thoughts about how that might impact things in the next few years.
Thanks for that question, Rachel. Partly because it's something that's so critically important to the sort of central set of ideas in my book, which is image doctoring in science. And so with AI, I think it's inevitable that we're seeing it be used for the purpose of creating false images and false data in science. And it's deeply troubling, and it's something that I think is going to be a problem, that it becomes bigger and bigger over time. On the other hand, one of the greatest things about AI in this realm right now is that AI tools have been developed that are used by people like Elizabeth and many others, people with whom I've worked closely, and a multitude of others out there, the kind of small army of image sleuths who are inspecting these images and bringing to light problems that could then be corrected. They're using these AI tools really effectively and finding things that would never have been found in the past. And so one result of it is that pressures being brought to bear on journals and funders and everyone to essentially being forced to deal with these issues in a way that they weren't before. And because the AI tools are possible to be used effectively by lay people, it doesn't just have to be experts in neuroscience, for example, the result is that you have a multitude of people who are putting their eyes on these things and forcing scientists who may be engaging in improper activities to deal with the criticism in a way that can result in course corrections.
And I don't know, this might be the wrong phrasing, but it might put the fear of God in some scientists who are thinking about doing it.
Indeed, and I'm not that religious of a person myself, but I don't see a really terrible contradiction between religious faith and science. And in fact, we've had some really illustrious scientists who are, religion is very important to them, including Matthew Schrag, who is in many ways the central character of my book. And one of the interesting things to me is that I think some of the ethical values in religion can really be well applied to science in a way that would address this problem of image doctoring head on.
You've done great work in this book pointing out the truth behind some whoppers and really the systemic way that fiction becomes fundable fact in medical research. I wonder, though, if you worry that you're cementing another confirmation bias, though, among all sorts of people who are already inclined to distrust Western medicine, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, I do. Obviously, I do feel concerned about that because when you're doing this kind of work in this current political climate and in the atomization of the media in such a way where a lot of kind of, frankly, very foolish ideas are being generated and disseminated, I think we all have to ask ourselves, how can we contribute to better understanding of these things? And I think, as I alluded to earlier, when you do journalism that's hard-hitting and questions the institutional authorities of our society, it's inevitable that it can be exploited by people for political gains, and it can be misunderstood. And so what I try to do is to reinforce the idea that it's our obligation as journalists to bring these ideas to the fore in a way where they can be used as tools to improve the situation. And also, it's my obligation to fight against the wrong-headed use of them, the wrong-headed use of these ideas and their exploitation in ways that are tearing down those institutions.
It's as if you sort of need to engage not just in an effort to educate people about the nature of the fraud in this particular instance, but also educate them about science, about journalism, about the way these sort of twin lines of inquiry work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the great experiences for me in writing this book is to develop close relationships with a wide range of scientists, and including the image sleuths who were so incredibly generous to help work on this larger body of work that went into the book. And what I've found is that there's a really big similarity between the people who are deeply committed to learning new information to help serve the development of building on treatments for Alzheimer's and other diseases, and the people who are kind of trying to hunt down the wrong information, the doctored evidence, the information that can lead science astray. These are really twin poles of the same goal, to come up with solutions for problems that we have in society and for problems in medicine. And I think really there's a lot of common cause there. And unfortunately, I think it's often misunderstood. And some of the people that are trying to expose this wrongdoing are kind of targeted and blamed for being part of the problem, which is an incredibly wrong way of looking at it.
One person asks, does Alzheimer's research have a uniquely high level of fraud, or is there evidence that other fields, especially other medical or basic research fields, may have similar issues?
I think the answer to that is quite clear. The answer is no. I think there's probably a comparable amount of misconduct in other scientific fields and also in every walk of life. People are people. Some people are corrupt, and you see it everywhere. It's particularly tragic within Alzheimer's disease, though, compared to other lines of medical research, because there's no really effective remedy for Alzheimer's disease. And when thinking is set back by even a tiny percentage of misconduct or fraud in the field, it's something that can be particularly painful and particularly hard to accept because of this lack of progress we've had.
I was just struck, again, reading this book, how often there was evidence of, it wasn't exactly confirmation bias, although that was part of it. It wasn't exactly complacency, but an almost Victorian form of professional courtesy, like a gentleman's pact. Like, I'm just going to presume because you went to the right schools, or you're working for the right research institution, that you probably know what you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There's so much of that goes on in scientific research, and I think it accounts for some of the complacency that we've seen. So, for example, journals, even some of the best journals, one of the reasons why they were way too slow to take seriously the importance of looking carefully at these scientific images to try to ensure that they weren't improperly manipulated is that they always had this feeling, these are our colleagues, of course we trust our colleagues. And in fairness, science is a team sport. Especially the complex, elaborate experiments that are done in biological sciences these days, it takes lots of hands, lots of different kinds of expertise. And without a degree of trust, there is no progress. On the other hand, in today's world, that trust has to be followed up by verification. And the excess of trust, the trust without verification, is what gets us into real trouble.
When should scientists give up on a particular line of research? How do you avoid missing out on the next mRNA, which was considered a dead end for decades until suddenly it wasn't? How do you maintain hope to continue hacking away at a problem from new, unexpected angles?
That's a really interesting question, and an excellent question, one that I've thought about a lot myself, in particular with regard to the amyloid hypothesis of Alzheimer's. So let me make it clear that I think even the diehard skeptics of that hypothesis don't say that amyloid has nothing to do with Alzheimer's disease. It's simply too much a part of the syndrome to reject out of hand. So the real question is not, does amyloid have something to do with the disease, but does it have everything to do with the disease? And the answer to that, I think, increasingly people are saying is no. The problem comes not from continuing to explore the permutations of how amyloid proteins might affect the brain. That's fine. People should do that because it's part of the puzzle that we're trying to solve. The problem happens when it becomes a singular way of looking at the disease such that it crowds out other creative thinking, and it prevents funding and mind share for innovative looks at the disease, and perhaps for renegades who might think differently and be able to come up with what might be an unconventional way of looking at the disease, to have sufficient funding to pursue their dream and their goal. And I'm happy to say that in the last few years, there has been the beginnings of a shift towards diversifying the research in the field in such a way that does not, of course, eliminate this conventional approach, but also looks at other ways of thinking about Alzheimer's that could bear fruit. I could name a couple of them that I find particularly interesting. One is the somewhat miraculous GLP-1 inhibitors. These are the weight loss drugs like Wegovy and others that have been associated with the possibility that they could have a beneficial effect and even a preventive effect on Alzheimer's disease. So there is now research going on, clinical trials. These are experiments with people testing out a new drug that suggests that there could be a lot of benefit to these drugs. And even by 2026, we may know the results of those experiments. So that's pretty interesting and encouraging. There's also something called the infection hypothesis of Alzheimer's, where it's thought that latent infections from things like herpes virus, which causes cold sores, and then these lesions go away, and people think I'm fortunately done with that. Unfortunately, the virus can sometimes hang out for many, many years, even decades, latently in organs of the body, including the brain. And some people think that it may be possible that they contribute to dementia. And there are tests going on, clinical trials going on, to try to treat those latent viruses in such a way that it could have a beneficial effect in Alzheimer's disease. I think, again, that's an innovative way of looking at it that could possibly bear fruit in the next few years. And I also wanted to mention something that I think about a lot personally, which is that we have agency in our lives associated with our health, and in particular associated with Alzheimer's disease, because we know that there are risk factors for Alzheimer's like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, healthful eating habits, and getting a lot of exercise. These are all things that can be ways for us to live our best lives and to have better lives that also can reduce our risk of having Alzheimer's if we're unlucky enough to be someone who might contract that disease late in life. So I just want people to understand that the possibility of being someone who can have agency and try to reduce our risk for Alzheimer's is very, very important.
So for somebody reading this book and thinking, it runs in my family, or I have people I worry about, this is just a terrible time to get this disease or to be at risk for getting this disease, you're here to say, nope, that's not the right way to think about it.
It's not. I mean, just to be clear, there is no magical nutritional supplement or brain game or way of operating in life that is a perfect way of preventing Alzheimer's disease. But it doesn't mean that you can't have any effect on forestalling some of the worst effects of the disease if you're conscientious and you take it upon yourself to, in fact, try to live your best life in those ways.
How do we incentivize more journalism like the journalism you're doing, especially in this environment of attacks on journalism from seemingly all sides?
Wow, well, that's a really wonderful question to get, and one that I genuinely feel terrible that I don't have a great answer for. Journalism's under attack. I'm finding in this particular moment, it's bizarrely under attack from people who generally are great supporters of hard-hitting journalism. I mentioned that scientist earlier, and I'm finding that people who believe deeply in the importance of exposing wrongdoing are terrified right now, and are terrified that they may themselves be targeted. And so I think one of the things we need to do is remember that journalism like this, the journalism that requires an enormous amount of time and expense to bring out stories vividly and to dig into documents and to try to expose the sorts of things that are complicated and require a lot of distillation into the stories that can reach people, that is very expensive work to do. Please remember that this work is costly. People should pay for their journalism. They should subscribe to newspapers, and they should support nonprofit journalism like the magazine that I work for, and support nonprofit investigative reporting in ways that it makes it possible for us to be able to bring this information out into the world.
Have you ever been sued or threatened to be sued for the kind of work that you do?
I have been threatened very often and never sued. Partly because I'm a very careful person, and I have excellent editors, and I have the deep determination to not just tell the story of scandal and difficulty in these fields, but to do it with basically as fair-minded and careful an approach as I can. So just to be clear about my process, when I am writing about apparent misconduct in Alzheimer's research or in other fields, part of my process is to, well in advance, go to the subject of my investigation and to do two things. One is to ask them questions about their work so that I can understand better what was going on in their minds and what their thoughts are about what my findings are, but also to provide to them all the details of what are going to be in a story. So when people like Elizabeth and Matthew Schrag have been so great as to help provide a dossier of findings of, say, 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 different studies that have been apparently altered, I provide that dossier to the subject of the work. I say to them, here's everything I've got. Here are questions that I'm asking that show exactly what's going to be ultimately in the article. And I ask them not because of just a sense of fairness, although that's critical, but because it's essential to the story to tell their side of it. And if they have a side to tell, unfortunately, most of them don't respond to those entreaties to tell their side of the story. And the reason, I think, usually is that they don't have a good story to tell.
Yeah, there's no explanation they've cooked up. But that said, now we seem to be in a new era where sometimes the lawsuit is not on the part of the person that you're accusing, but just meant to shut you up, to get you to back down. Do you worry that you could be the target of such a lawsuit in the near future?
I do worry about it. I worry about it. But I have to say that as a result, I've prepared myself for it. And I mentioned that I've been threatened. I mean, no journalist likes to be threatened legally or obviously not to be sued. And the reason is that it's enormously time-consuming. So when I'm threatened with a possible lawsuit, because it's a legal matter, I spend an enormous amount of time that I could be using to scout out new stories or to tell stories better or to follow up on stories that I've done. Instead, I'm using it to annotate 10-page legal threats so that my lawyers can then write a 10-page legal response. And this is part of the process. And also, of course, I have to be sure that I'm legally indemnified in order to do a book like this. So I have legal protection through my publishing house, but I also took out millions of dollars in liability insurance, not because I'm afraid that I would lose a lawsuit, because I feel very secure in knowing that I'm a careful person and the work that I do is based on doing everything humanly possible to have it be as credible as possible, which means it being right. And that said, anyone can sue for anything, and these are very costly suits to defend, so you have to be prepared for it.
We are a litigious culture, have been historically. Can you explain the relationship between doctored images and doctored data? How false were the results? And has the science of forensic imagery of this nature evolved recently? Is that why they've been caught?
So let's see. Let me just state clearly that doctored images are the same thing as doctoring data. The images are the data in most of these experiments. And so if you change an image, what you're doing is you're basically changing the results of the experiment. Maybe it would be useful to just digress for a second and give people a little bit of a picture of what I'm talking about when I say doctored images. So in Alzheimer's research, the two primary kinds of images that I'm talking about are something called micrographs, which are highly enlarged images, photographic images of things like brain tissue. So it could be human brains or animal brains. And so what people can do is they can copy certain elements of the images and move them around into other parts. They can enhance the contrast or reduce the contrast to make certain features be more prominent. And when they do these things, they can be trying to accentuate elements of the experiment that would tend to support their hypothesis. This is improper and can be scientific fraud. Another kind of image that is prevalent in this research is something that looks at proteins. It's called a Western blot, and it looks like a stacked series of irregularly shaped bands, kind of a ladder configuration. And Western blots display the types and concentrations of proteins within a tissue sample. And that's important because, like I mentioned, the experiment involving the star protein, amyloid beta star 56, what they do is they display it in these Western blot images. And so if you take these Western blot blobs and you change their shape, or you move them around, or you erase them with an erasure tool, or you make them look bigger and bolder, you can show that certain experimental effects appear to be more prominent, more prevalent in the experiment. And so in this experiment that I was describing, these Western blots were altered in really substantial ways that tended to support the experimental hypothesis. But when they were exposed as having been digitally manipulated, the hypothesis fell apart. And that's why getting the images, the data itself is the image. And so being able to discern what's there is crucial to understanding what's going on.
Making a picture look more pretty, so to speak, is really a crime.
It can be. I mean, sometimes there is a digital manipulation that is more or less trivial, and scientific publications look the other way. Other scientists might say, okay, it's a kind of slight beautification of the image. But it's a slippery slope going from beautification, if you can use that as a kind of term of art, to manipulating images in a way that changes their meaning. And that is where we get into misconduct and fraud.
Has the research you've done for this book, which was a lot of work, changed the way you think about science and scientists?
That's a tough one because I've always been a skeptical person, and as a journalist, it's my job to sort of hunt down where some of these problems may exist. So I wouldn't say it has fundamentally changed my ideas, but one thing that has really opened my eyes is, one, understanding how prevalent this kind of possible misconduct has been, and two is understanding how in our modern era, how prevalent the number of eyes on it are. So this army of forensic image sleuths is really uncovering a lot of amazing information that is making it possible to course correct and to correct the record in ways that I really didn't fully understand until quite recently.
It really is a big reason for hope, not just in science, but in other industries as well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
This last question may not be answerable tonight, but let's give it a go. What are the prospects of early detection of Alzheimer's and a cure?
Okay. At the risk of getting out of my lane a little bit here, I'll say that I have enormous hope that both early detection and a possible cure are not, they're not decades away, not many decades away. I think it's going to take time to use artificial intelligence and use the advanced techniques that are being developed to come up with other possible solutions. But as I mentioned earlier, I think there's hope because new ideas are flooding into the field and new drugs are being developed that could inject new possibilities that would, lead to fruitful ideas in the field. So not immediately, but maybe not that far off on the horizon.
Well, Charles, I want to thank you for this book and for your time tonight talking with us. Thank you also to our audience for joining us and your thoughtful questions. Charles will be signing copies of his book in the lounge outside the auditorium right after this. Finally, let me say that Commonwealth Club World Affairs warmly encourages you to come back for future programs, to become a member, and to support the mission of nurturing vital civic education, engagement, and dialogue. To find out more, please visit the website at www.commonwealthclub.org. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.